Stuart Taylor is with me today, and he is one of our nation's most distinguished legal journalists. He has a law degree from Harvard, where he graduated at the top of his class and served as an editor at the Law Review. He's written for the New York Times, the National Journal, myriad other prominent news outlets. His new book, co-authored with Brooklyn College professor Casey Johnson, documents an alarming assault on justice and reason on our nation's campuses. It's titled The Campus Rape Frenzy. Stuart, welcome to AEI.
Wonderful to be with you, and if I might make an editorial comment, I love your moniker, the Factual Feminist.
Yes,
I am. We need more factual feminists.
Yes, we do. Well, you are the deputy factual feminist because your book is so good. It's so thorough. It's an expose of the campus rape frenzy. Tell us about that. What is it for those who may not know?
Yes, well, driven largely by the Obama administration, although it's a phenomenon that started in the 90s, really. There's been a huge misleading frenzy to the effect that there's something called a rape culture on our campuses, that rape is rampant, that it's an epidemic, that it's increasing, that the colleges don't care about it and won't do anything for the victims. And the Obama administration has driven this by aligning itself with left-wing academics, by suddenly in 2011, on April 4th, 2011, proclaiming a whole bunch of decrees, the purpose of which was to destroy the due process rights of young men in college who are accused by young women in college. Sometimes it's a man and a man, or a woman and a woman, but in general, men accused by women of sexual assault, although really it doesn't really have to meet the definition of sexual assault to get you in trouble these days. It's morphed into a comprehensive system of federally directed regulation of all sex on campus.
Oh my.
This doesn't mean every time anybody does anything it gets regulated, but it potentially reaches just about the most ordinary part, consensual sex you can imagine. If somebody decides, usually the woman, a day, a month, a year, 2 years later, gee, I didn't like that. I wish I hadn't done it. That's all. The guy can get kicked out over that alone.
One of the things I've noticed is that the definition of sexual assault is very elastic. It's constantly changing. Now, most people think of some kind of aggressive, violent attack, or they think of rape. But what does it encompass now when they use it? What can a young man be brought up on charges for?
Well, you've got to distinguish the criminal law from the campus situation.
Oh, okay.
Under the criminal law, the definition is expanded over the years, but it's still, pretty reasonable. If there's sex without consent, doesn't even have to be forcible in most states. If there's sex without consent and the male is the initiator, as they usually presume, that is rape. If there's an unwanted touching over the woman's objection, any intimate part, that is sexual assault. It might be a very small case, but it's sexual assault. On campuses, on the other hand, and also, I should say, in the criminal law, if the woman is passed out drunk,
right,
that's rape. On campus, she doesn't have to be passed out drunk to make it rape. She just has to be a little bit intoxicated. It varies from place to place. The federal government has not defined rape or sexual assault for purposes of the campuses, but the campuses have defined it, and they've done their definitions with the federal government looking over their shoulder with a general attitude saying, you better kick a lot of people out because we know there's a lot of unpunished. So they define it very broadly, and often when I say that almost all sex that goes on campus is potentially within this, there are campuses where if the woman, it's usually the woman, much later decides she didn't really want to do it and she wishes she hadn't, even if she doesn't claim that she resisted or said no or
But
pushed.
Someone saw her drinking a margarita.
Yeah, somebody saw her drinking a margarita. That will get you kicked out if you're the young man at a lot of campuses, and I could tell you stories, including the Yale basketball captain who's been kicked out on stories like that.
I saw at one college, they had defined assault to include coercion. And coercion means, did anyone ever try to talk you into sex or tell you lies that, or manipulate you in some way? Now, that might not be gentlemanly behavior, but we're not in the Victorian age, and we don't call that assault.
Right.
But they're implying that it is punishable as if it were a violation. So this is also, people should understand that it's just like you send a young man to college, and any parent should warn him to be absolutely careful. Now, some people say, well, that's good. Maybe we should go back to an age where young men were taught to be protective of women, and maybe, and actually, in a way, I'm thinking maybe this is a reaction to the hookup culture where there was so much promiscuity. Maybe this is sort of the liberals' way of bringing some moderation to the campus hookup culture, and they call it the rape culture. But I think there's probably a better way to do it than setting up kangaroo courts.
Especially since the same universities that are setting up the kangaroo courts are also distributing condoms, sex manuals on how to have fun sex, encouraging rampant sex.
And doing nothing about the binge drinking.
Doing nothing about the binge drinking. And then after all the things the university helped happen, and a woman complains later on, it's the man's fault. And they go after him now. Sometimes.
What if they're both drinking? They both have 2 glasses of wine. They have sex, and for whatever reason, she brings charges. Can he show that he had the same amount of, and he could be exonerated? Or can he take her, if he puts in the charge first, is he?
Theoretically, he could, but not in the real world. First, if she files a charge and the guy then says, well, then she did it too, they will often say, well, that's retaliation. We're not going to listen to that. Yeah. And the dean of students, Sue Wasilek's her name, at Duke University, was testifying, and she was asked, well, what happens if both of them are drunk? And she said, well, in that case, it would be the fault of the male, and he's a rapist or whatever. Now, campuses aren't always quite as frank as that in saying what their attitude is, but that's their attitude.
You've described some very unsavory individuals they sound to be. I think there are probably a lot of campus Title IX officers and people that they want to do the best, but they're given a lot of misinformation. There's pressure from the government to hand over, guilt verdicts, and so they end up being part of something that is these mock courts or these kangaroo courts, and without ever really thinking it through. And without, where could they go without risking losing their job? So all the incentives are in favor of just going along with the system.
Yeah, especially because they're reporting. I mean, the federal government is looking over their shoulder. They are appointed largely to appease the federal government by doing to the campus males whatever the federal government seems to want them to do on a case-by-case basis. And also, think for a minute, I'm sure some of them are great people. Think for a minute who would want that job, knowing that you are an agent of the federal government in all but name, there for the purpose of administering biased judges against young men, and that's your job and that's your responsibility, and you're going to be in trouble if you don't do that. Who wants that job? I don't think it's the type of person we want to be exercising that kind of power over our young people.
Well, there they are. We have this elaborate bureaucracy, these campus sort of sex apparatchiks marching around. And what happens to people that oppose it, to dissidents? And a professor who questions it or a student who organized against it?
Very few do. But for example, when the Yale basketball captain who I mentioned was railroaded out of Yale based on a bogus charge of sexual assault or sexual misconduct or whatever they called it, the basketball team rallied around him and they wore his number or something like that. They were hammered by the Yale administration, trashed by the Women's Center, attacked by kind of a mob of activists, and unfortunately they could see that this was going to end badly for them, and they basically backed off and apologized. That's what usually happens, and most people, including professors these days, we haven't gotten to the threat to freedom of speech, so-called harassment, that this administration has increased, and it was already there. But most professors, even tenured professors, know perfectly well that if they speak out against this sort of thing, they're going to get picketed, they're going to get attacked, there's going to be a social media campaign against them, the university's going to be looking to whether to bring a Title IX charge against them. I know personally some professors who just say, I could get tenured professors who say, I could get pushed out of my job if I speak out against this.
Well, as you know, I've written about this myself. I'm very alarmed what's going on. And in your book, you and Casey Johnson make it clear that you're concerned about victims of sexual assault. Any reasonable, fair-minded person is. But even at that level, what's happening on campus isn't helping assault victims. It's just created this, as you say, this kind of a moral panic, and they're rushing to judgment and replacing it. It looks to me as though they're replacing our tradition of the presumption of innocence with guilty because accused.
Exactly. Now, I should make it clear, we hate sexual assault. We hate rape. We are very much champions of victims of them, and we know that there's a lot of it that goes on campus, off campus, always has, probably always will, but at least we'd like to reduce it. What we oppose is injustice here. What we're coming in, lots of people hate sexual assault. They didn't need us to make that point. What we see happening is a presumption of guilt, a rush to judgment, an effort to presume that all males are guilty if accused of anything they're guilty of, that when a woman's the accuser, and to brand them rapists and to kick them out of college or suspend them, in many cases ruining lives, PTSD, suicide attempts, the whole bit. The kinds of things you hear that happen to rape victims, and they do, also happen to falsely accused young men.
Well, so someone argued that things are so bad on campus, there's this epidemic, a plague of violence, and we need to take strong measures. And while it's too bad that there's some innocent will suffer, overall, it's just better this way all round if we have these strong measures. What would you say to that?
Two main points. A, there's not an epidemic. There's not a rape culture. And B, it's not making, this huge effort is not making things any safer for women.
Okay, you say there's not a rape epidemic, and explain that, because people hear 1 in 4, 1 in 5 women will be.
An epidemic suggests something that's huge and growing. Now, is it huge? Well, I guess if it's always been huge, it's still huge. There's way too much sexual assault, there's way too much rape, but it's nothing like 1 in 5. At the time the administration acted, the rape rate on campus, the percentages, according to the best federal statistics, had plunged by more than half over the previous 15 years. Plunged, not increased. It's not increasing. Some of the numbers are increasing lately because they've been basically tampered with by
advocacy research.
Yeah. Let's take the 1 in 5 idea. The best federal research, Bureau of Justice Statistics, which has been the best federal crime research for many years, would tell you about 1 in 40, maybe 1 in 50 sexually assaulted, maybe 1 in 100 raped. Sexually assault would include a pat on the rear end. It's technically a crime, but you know, there are degrees. The way these surveys get to 1 in 5, and the President of the United States has embraced this number, is by phoning up the statistics. First, they get very small sample sizes. Women motivated to complain tend to be the ones who answer the samples. Second, they define all kinds of activity that's perfectly legal, that's not thought of commonly as sexual assault at all, and they define it as sexual assault. You know, has anybody ever had sex with you when you had been drinking? Has anybody ever had sex with you when you really didn't want them to, whether or not you told them you didn't want to, and so forth. And so there are all sorts of things. And this is quite revealing. They never, these survey takers, and they're kind of a group of them, and they all do the same game. And the Washington Post has done it, and Pew Research has done it, and the American, you know, they never ask the people being surveyed, have you been raped? Have you been sexually assaulted? Because they know from history.
A low number.
That very low number. So it's, I hesitate whether to call these surveys highly misleading, which is an understatement, or fraudulent, which might be an overstatement, somewhere in that spectrum.
But these numbers would make it seem, if we took them seriously, it would mean that when a young woman enters a campus, Wesleyan or Brandeis or Stanford, she's at as much risk as she would be, or more risk than she would be in Detroit, or more than that, maybe in war-torn Congo. I mean, these numbers are so high, and yet people send their daughters to college. And you know, who would send a child to college if you thought they had a 1 in 4, 1 in 5 chance of being victimized by a serious, felony assault? You
exactly.
wouldn't.
You know, the evidence that the administration and the colleges that jump on this bandwagon, they don't take these numbers seriously themselves. They use them as propaganda. If they took them seriously, there would be cops all over the campus. There would be security guards everywhere.
They wouldn't allow alcohol
They
on
would
campus.
not allow co-ed dorms, let alone co-ed bathrooms. There would be no alcohol on campus. You know, maybe they'd go back to single-sex schools. If they took, they're not doing any of those things. They're not doing anything that shows real seriousness. It's all a big, misleading panic.
It's a panic. Well, before we get to this, what is it like to be a young man, or could be a young, I read some terrible cases of young women falsely accused as well, but tell a typical case, of, you know, a picture of what happens to a young man today when accused on campus.
Okay. I'll give you a real case, not a hypothetical one,
Okay.
and I could give you 40 probably, except my memory.
Well, there are about 100 young men suing right now. And
Right,
to read through
yeah.
these cases is
Yeah.
to go to into Kafka's trial, but go on.
But here's a case at Amherst, and one thing that's striking about this and somewhat unusual is that the young man who was ejected from Amherst on a charge of sexually assaulting the young woman was in fact a victim of a sexual assault by the young woman. That's what really happened, and the evidence that proves it, text message evidence, was readily available to the college if they had bothered to look for it.
Yeah, she was sending texts to her friend saying,
Yes.
"Oh, I just did that," and
Yeah.
he had been
It
passed
starts
out.
with them, you know, making out in a very sexual way in front of other people in some common area in the dorm. And somebody says, you know, why don't you all go get a room? So she takes the guy back to his room. By her account, she was a little bit tipsy. By all accounts, he was passed out drunk or very close. She gave him oral sex for whatever reason she wanted to. It's not clear he was even aware this was happening. He doesn't remember anything. And then she sent him away, and she called in another guy who she'd been flirting with earlier in the evening and had more sex. And then she began to feel bad because, oh, that first guy was my roommate's boyfriend. My roommate's away, but she's going to find out, and it's going to be very socially awkward with our friends. So she started telling people she'd been sexually assaulted. She joined a feminist anti-rape group on campus, and many, many, many months later, I think it was more than a year later, she actually filed a claim of sexual assault. The investigation by the college was ludicrous. Her testimony was incoherent. The whole thing was a giant fraud, and apparently driven by Amherst's fear that the federal government would say they're not being tough enough on sexual assault. And then after he got the text message, and they kicked him out, after he hired a lawyer, the lawyer asked around, anybody got any text messages, got some text messages, and the text messages proved the facts that I've just told you conclusively. The guy took the facts back to the college, Amherst, and Amherst said, sorry, too late, you're kicked out, and it's final.
And he's kicked out and marked as a predator. And these people that get kicked out of college, they have a hard time getting into another school. And it's also devastating psychologically to be accused. You're seen as a pariah. I've read reports from psychologists what it's like to treat falsely accused people.
Exactly.
And it's psychically devastating.
We have too. And there's two aspects worth mentioning. One, these things are almost always done in secret. Federal privacy laws and so forth, which means it's impossible usually until a case gets into court. And this Amherst guy sued in court, which is how we know all the facts we know, to know what went on. And so the guy usually doesn't get on Google as a rapist, but everybody on the campus knows who he was.
Right.
And the word gets around, and there's a movement to put it on transcripts. And when he tries to apply to another college, they tend to turn him down. And so it has a lifelong effect, potentially a horrible lifelong effect. It leads to depression, it leads to post-traumatic stress syndrome, it defeats career opportunities. It's often regarded by people who are anti-rape activists as, oh, well, the guy just picks himself and moves on. No, he doesn't pick himself up and move on. And I just should add, the Vice President of the United States, Joe Biden, has admitted unwittingly that this has done absolutely nothing, all this, to reduce the number of rapes on campus.
As far as I can tell, the numbers, even their advocacy studies, they've been doing them for years, the numbers never change. It's now they're saying 1 in 5. and they still have studies that it's 1 in 4.
And what Biden recently said was it was 1 in 5 20 years ago, and it's still 1 in 5.
Right.
Okay, you can do the math. It's done. Your program, Mr. Biden, has done no good at all.
In your book, you cite the words of Congressman Jared Polis from Colorado, and he said, this is in a 2015 congressional hearing, if there are 10 people who have been accused, and under a reasonable likelihood standard, maybe 1 or 2 of them did it, it seems better to get rid of all 10 people. A congressman said that. Now, this...
one would hope not for
we
long.
have this venerable legal principle, presumption of innocence. Is it being replaced by guilty because accused?
What this guy Polis said just takes one's breath away. You know, you have to wonder if he was hallucinating. You know, the old Blackstone thing was, you know, better 10 go free who are guilty than 1 be imprisoned who's innocent.
And there's a reason for that, that we have such a revulsion towards the innocent being punished, because all the machinery of the state comes down, and they have, you know, resources and all sorts of powers, and the individuals alone. And the cases we hear about are the ones that are brought to trial, where the young man, usually a young man, has the money to get a lawyer. Think of all the cases we don't hear about.
Oh, you're right.
And so, anyway, this is, there are now judges that are looking at these cases, and you've cited them in the book. They go through them, and there was one judge in Massachusetts, we think he was looking at a case at Brandeis, and he looked at it and he said that it reminded him of Salem, Massachusetts, and not the United States of America in 2015 or 16, whenever he said it. And you do see a lot of talk about Salem or sexual McCarthyism. People talk about kangaroo courts, and do you think that that's, having written this book, you've seen enough to agree with those strong assessments?
Very emphatically. I would not have believed that so much injustice committed by people with great credentials, right, university people, committed for often cynical reasons or ideology. I would not have believed that it was possible for this to happen in the United States until I became immersed in the facts. My co-author, Casey Johnson, knows more about these cases than anyone alive, and a lot of the ones in the book, you know, he's read all the court records, and you just read these cases and you think, how could this possibly have happened? And one way it happens is that although the Judge Saylor in the Brandeis case you mentioned was good, and the 3 democratically appointed federal appeals court judges in New York were good in that case. They basically, in another case I think, they basically said this looks like discrimination against men, what's going on. Not all judges are good on this. Some judges, there were a couple of judges in California on an appeals court who heard a case from the University of California, San Diego, where one of them said during the argument, this looks like a kangaroo court. And then they upheld it. And then they said, well, it's not our job, we're just federal judges, we're not supposed to tell
I think they don't yet understand how much suffering and anguish is involved. And it's because, yes, rape is a heinous crime, and a victim of a rape suffers horribly, but it's because it's such a serious crime that we have to be very careful about branding someone as a sex predator, as a rapist. And we've lost that concern. Now, how did this happen? Who are the players? Not that I don't have my own ideas, but in your book you mention all sorts of, a kind of axis of madness. You have risk-averse administrators, you have academics, activists, you have the federal government coming in, and this whole sex bureaucracy that's built up in the campuses, and it's all come together. The media,
oh boy,
let's talk, how is the media handled all of this? Because there should have been a book like this, 60 Minutes should have been on this, there should have been Frontline about, you know, witch hunts on our college campus, and we really haven't seen that.
The media have been shamelessly biased. The New York Times leading the pack. Every time the New York Times ever writes about campus sex case, as far as I've seen, I might have missed one, but everyone I've ever seen, they grotesquely distort the facts to make it look absolutely clear that the male was guilty and the woman was pure and virtuous and honest. even when the evidence is either much more conflicted or even when it clearly proves the innocence of the male. They did it in the Duke lacrosse rape fraud case
yes,
in 2006. Yes,
the New York Times was horrible, and after everyone was talking about this travesty at Duke with the lacrosse team, falsely accused, the Times was saying, well, no, the case still makes sense. No, it didn't make sense. Why did,
and we, and Casey Johnson and I, exposed in our Duke lacrosse book how bad they were, and one of their editors at some point said, well, we're going to be more careful about these things, but they haven't improved a bit. And they're not unrepresentative. If you look at, you remember the Rolling Stone case article about University of Virginia? Well, not only was Rolling Stone outrageous, and they're losing libel cases now, and basically it was a fraudulent article that they fell for, the entire media, they printed this ridiculous claim by a woman that she had been gang raped over broken glass by 7 or 8 guys at the University of Virginia fraternity. All of the evidence, it was implausible on its face. Every bit of evidence that's ever emerged shows that it didn't happen, and yet the news media as a group all credit it immediately, raised the clamor, this shows we have a rape culture, and all through the process of it being proved false, you know, kind of some of them quieted down a little bit, but none of them ever said we're sorry, except maybe Rolling Stone without really saying it seriously.
Right, and eventually there were some journalists working in the background at Reason, and there was a blogger, what was his name, Bradley? Richard Bradley.
Robbie Sove, if I pronounce it right, at Reason, and Richard Bradley, who's a blogger, exposed it quite early, saying, wait a minute, this doesn't add up.
And they were just being good journalists who had a sense that something was amiss and it didn't add up.
And then the Washington Post, which has by and large been part of the hysteria, they, to their credit, to the credit of one of their reporters to be exact, printed some facts that showed that it couldn't have happened the way the woman said, and the story fell apart. And yet, not only did the national media never really set the record straight, a lot of people still think there was a big rape at the University of Virginia of this woman, but the administration of the University of Virginia, the faculty of the University of Virginia, even the student body at the University of Virginia, more or less all rushed to judgment too, and none of them ever changed their attitude, even as the facts were proved false.
Well, I've noticed that the journalists just credulously repeat the false statistics, and they repeat stories. For example, at Columbia University with Mattress Girl, that was told from her point of view. They didn't seem to be concerned that the young man had been found not responsible by 1 or 2 tribunals, sex courts on campus. They didn't seem to matter. And she was actually carrying out a vigilante action against him. And she got class credit, or maybe credit towards her degree.
She did.
And she was treated as a heroine by the media.
And all the evidence isn't quite clear there. One thing that's very clear, she was sending I love you emails to the supposed rapist weeks after the supposed rape. Right. She has no credibility at all, and yet Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, a Democrat,
Senator Gillibrand
took her to the 2015 State of the Union address, and made her into a heroine.
Shouldn't Kirsten Gillibrand and the other legislators, everyone really, care about due process? What has happened to due process? Just with these young people who are accused, do they get a lawyer? Do they get to cross-examine? Do they have the right to, once they're found innocent, they're not put on trial again? Or is it the reverse?
The reverse, and this takes me back to the Obama administration's very major role in this. In the April 4th, 2011 directives they sent, they dictated procedures for these cases. And one was the lowest possible standard of proof. Not clear and convincing, certainly not, preponderance of the evidence, 50.01%. Another was, you better not let these guys cross-examine the women, or let anybody cross-examine
because they'll be
the
re-traumatized.
Re-traumatized.
So they're presuming
right.
that she's a survivor and that he's the perpetrator.
Yeah. And the relevance of that is, first, the Supreme Court has repeatedly said cross-examination is the best legal engine ever devised by the law for getting at the truth. They've said it more than once. And we're talking about he said, she said cases often, where if you can't really test the veracity of the woman, it's pretty much over. The guy doesn't get to have a lawyer in the proceedings. He doesn't get to see all the evidence that's going to be used against him. He doesn't get to see the evidence that's in his favor. The procedures are all completely rigged to maximize the point of accusers. And the people who do the deciding, if there's a board, they're often coached by so-called trainers, to presume guilt.
And the trainers come in believing all of the advocacy statistics. They believe that 1 in 5 is a victim of assault.
Yeah.
They believe that women rarely lie. There's another false statistic, and you
Right.
expose a number of them.
The trainers at Stanford, for example, said, among other things, 2 things that don't coexist well. One is, if the man's story is articulate and persuasive, that's a sign of guilt.
Oh, and if he's being too logical.
If he's being a little bit, if he's too logical.
Right.
If he's vague and kind of wanders around, why, that's a sign of guilt too. In other words, everything he says is a sign of guilt.
So they're using the lowest standard of proof. They have no way to defend themselves, and they're none of the usual means. And the committee is just arbitrary. It could be a librarian, it could be a dean, a couple of students. They're the sex court. They're not trained except by these experts that come in. And they will be told that women rarely lie. Sometimes some of the materials say only in what they cite 2% of cases, and that goes back to a book in the 70s by Susan Brown Miller. She just stated it. I don't think she had a source for that. There is no source.
She said she'd heard some judge said it based on some study that was never made public,
well,
but it's nonsense.
It's
lots and lots of women are victimized, and lots of other women make it up for various reasons, or lie or embellish.
And I think women sometimes lie about being raped, not because they're women, but because they're human beings. Human beings sometimes lie, especially about sex. There are many, many reasons we've seen already in the notorious cases, the Duke lacrosse and the UVA case.
On the campuses with the administration pushing it, I'm thinking of a case called Occidental and a woman named Danielle Dirks, who was a professor, a radical
very radical, very hard line.
A young woman who had a drunken tryst with a young guy, 2 freshmen, and she was complaining to a roommate or somebody like that. She didn't call back. It wasn't very good. Somebody directed her to Danielle Dirks, and Danielle Dirks said, well, this guy is the typical campus rapist. How do I know that? Well, he's from a good family. He was a high school valedictorian. He had good grades, and he was an athlete. Well, those are the guys who are obviously guilty. Right. So that is the attitude that goes into a lot of the campus adjudications.
Gender profiling.
Yeah. And the one thing that the administration's been pushing people to do is to have a single person be the investigator, prosecutor, judge, and jury. Let's not put this in front of, say, a panel of students who might actually find the guy innocent. Let's make it very clear that he's totally at the mercy of somebody who's looking over her shoulder. It's almost always a her, by the way, at the other hers in the Obama Education Department who are saying, you'd better bring us some heads.
I think that by the way, it's not only the Obama administration, there are a number of Republicans who are on this, have joined with this campaign, this crusade about the campus rape culture, and very, very poorly informed. It's unfortunately bipartisan. However, I think that what led the legislators, and as well as the journalists, originally there were the academic feminists. And this all started, I saw it happening way back in the last century. You had professors who believe, gender studies professors, who believe that American society is a patriarchy and that women are held down and held back. And then you had very radical figures like Catherine McKinnon, Andrea Dworkin, who believed that we were captive to a culture where rape was an instrument of oppression used by men to keep women in their place. It's part of the structure of society. So they feel that we need to go outside the American legal tradition, which was, after all, created by men invested in a violent patriarchy. So they have no inhibitions about throwing aside due process and freedom of expression and even punishing an occasional innocent person, because they think they're dealing with this patriarchal oppression. So they don't care. Now, these ideas were half-baked, And it's just a lot of twisted, paranoid theories that have no basis in reality, which almost anyone could say. But if you challenge their theories, that just proves you don't understand them. And that proves that you're an apologist for the rape culture. Somehow, these theories, which were not taken seriously by anyone outside these sort of esoteric departments in the academy, they've moved into the mainstream. And suddenly I'm seeing them in women's magazines, and I think it was the statistics, these false statistics came to be believed, or these dubious statistics, took on, they got to a point where they were beyond the reach of rational analysis. So we do have the makings of this panic. And do you see a way out of it?
It is like the Salem witch trials, and in a different way, it's like the McCarthy era, and it's like the daycare, scares of the 1990s.
Satanic cults in daycares.
Satanic people, yeah, when babies were being thrown into streams, beheaded and so forth, except nobody could find the bodies. People believed it. And Catherine McKinnon, who you mentioned, has been lionized by, academic feminists. I think one of her famous quotes is, "I call it rape whenever a woman has sex and feels violated." I think that's almost verbatim. Yeah. So this has become an ideology that swept the campuses with huge, expansion of gender studies programs. They're sort of in the business of spreading this ideology. And frankly, because of the state of the campuses, it's hard for me to be at all confident that we're ever going to see the end of this, or at least see it anytime soon. I hope that the new Trump administration, and I'm certainly not a pro-Trump person, but I do hope that his education secretary, Betsy DeVos, if she's confirmed, and the rest of his administration will do at least one very good thing for America, which is dismantle this sex bureaucracy machinery, at least in the federal level, that the Obama administration has created. But that would only be a start, a little bit of a start on fixing this, because the sex bureaucracies in the universities, the feminist kind of biases in the universities, they've swept over universities from coast to coast, with a few exceptions, and they're full of ideas that the average American, if he heard them or she heard them, would consider laughable. The average woman who considers herself a feminist would consider them laughable, but because they're in the academic ghettos, they kind of
Well, a lot of feminists have come out against this. People like Wendy Kaminer and Janet Haley at Harvard, Nadine Strawson, the former president of the ACLU. They've been some
Nadine
of the most
wrote a very nice.
Nadine is fantastic. Nancy Gerstner, Nancy Gertner in Massachusetts. They've been wonderful, but they're not listened to.
No, and 5 Harvard Law School professors have been better than most academics. Most academics have had their head in the sand. 28 Harvard Law faculty members signed a statement, an eloquent statement, denouncing what the federal government was forcing Harvard to do, what Harvard in fact did, although they got an exception made for the law school, and very eloquent. And these are pretty liberal folks. And 5 of them, you've mentioned 3 or 4, but 5, another comes to mind is Betsy Bartholet,
she's been wonderful.
Are leading feminists.
Yes.
And, every serious civil libertarian I know, and every feminist who I respect, and I respect a lot of them, who's seen what's going on, realizes how pernicious this is, but it persists.
Well, maybe it's going to take, a famous academic feminist to find her son brought up on charges and taken through a kangaroo court. Maybe it's going to, what will it take for I think back to France in the Alfred Dreyfus case, and Émile Zola writing J'accuse, and it was J'accuse, it was the most famous headline of all time in a newspaper, and he accused, the French military, the press, everyone, of taking part in convicting an innocent man. And it just became a famous symbol of people becoming aware that we had committed just this heinous injustice. All of us had somehow were guilty, and Zola conveyed that in J'accuse, and I see your book as possibly doing that. I hope so. I don't think any journalist that writes about the sexual assault on campus, anybody on a committee, any dean, if they don't read this, I think it's malfeasance. They're not doing their job. You've done such a good job. It's meticulous. It's careful. The tone, all of it is really, really fine. So let's hope it makes a difference, because this can't go on.
Well, having the Factual Feminist on our side.
Oh, yes. Well, I will do what I can. I urge people to buy.
Makes me feel much more optimistic than I would otherwise.
I'll do my best, and let's stop the madness.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming.